Yes, warm welcome to everybody. Good afternoon. Esteemed guests, the opening of the fourth edition already of the Forum on European Culture, our biannual forum, today is in a theatre and we will reflect on this year's theme, a culture of democracy, a culture of imperialism. And to open this year's forum, we have the great privilege and pleasure of hosting two remarkable persons who made significant contributions to their respective fields. You'll hear more from them soon, Claude Jongstra and Peter Frankopan. Why, but first a little bit, why do we organize the Forum on European Culture and why do we call it this year a culture of democracy? Well, one reason is to distinguish, to make a place, another place than Brussels, and to make clear that Europe is not Brussels, is not the Union, but is something different. Also to show that it's for artists, authors and creatives to shape the future of Europe and not only for economists and politicians. There's ample place for politicians and economists to shape the future of our continent, but where is the space and the place for artists and creatives to do the same? So this year, a culture of democracy, a culture of imperialism, two sides of the same coin. Peter Sloterdijk once said that Europe was the club of nations that had definitely and definitively abandoned the idea of empire. Is this still true? Or is Europe still navigating between Scylla and Charybdis of democracy and imperialism? We've drawn a divide between old and new democracies along what used to be the Iron Curtain. Yet, as the Ukrainian author Oksana Zabushko points out in a letter to the Forum on European Culture this year, she points out, it might be wiser to see the divide as one between former empires and former colonies. From a Ukrainian, that is an interesting statement, I would say, at this moment. We believe the environmental question is at the very heart of these crossroads at the moment. Like the late Bruno Latour suggests, climate is the defining question in politics and culture today. We shall be defined by what we decide to do in the face of climatic changes, by the question whether we're able to reinvent our relationship to nature and the environment. And faced with the magnitude of the challenges, Europe cannot be or cannot think small. There's a genuine European responsibility. War and steep environmental changes are banging on our doors. So will Europeans drift back into their bad dreams of empire and nationalism? Or can we reinvent our culture to be democratic and tackle environmental challenges, even with the authoritarianism on our borders and the authoritarianism within? Because the whole mindset of a culture of imperialism, of extraction, of exploitation, is still very much with us. The idea of the slave plantation lives on in our agricultural practices. And as Timothy Snyder pointed out earlier in this same hall, democracy is undone from within rather than from without. So a culture of democracy is something which needs to be internalized in order to survive. And in this theater, we're going to talk to Peter Frankopan, who writes himself in his latest book, we're going to speak about The Earth Transformed. I quote, the environment and climate provide the very stage on which our existence plays out, shaping everything we do, who we are, where and how we live, and like most stages, it can be all too easy to think only about what happens on the stage, so what the protagonists do and say, without thinking about the fabric of the set itself. Actors come and go, but if the theater closes or collapses, that marks the end of us all. So what's the theater we're on? The theater we're on, of course, is the environment, the planet we live on. First we influence our climate, and then our climate influences us, or the other way around. And that's the important message, one of the important messages of this very interesting book. Besides the fitting location, of course, a theater, to have this conversation, this metaphor fits us very well. It's obvious that democracy has something to do with the way we treat our environment. And let's talk about that. And I'm very happy that we managed to get this wonderful piece of art behind me here to look at. It was quite difficult to get it here today and get it back tonight. We're very happy that we managed to get it here. It's made by Claudia Jongster. We're very happy that we worked for weeks and that we managed to get it here. It's a traveling piece. It's called the Guernica de la Ecologia, made by Claudia Jongster, like I said. And I think it's a very fitting backdrop for the opening and for our conversation. Before I start, and I invite Claudia Jongster to talk about this wonderful piece of art, I'd like to say some formal things. First and foremost, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude for the European Cultural Foundation. Thank you very much for your unwavering trust and invaluable support. And thank you for a strong belief in the transformative power of culture and art. Thank you very much. And we're very honored that Her Royal Highness Princess Laurentien, President of the European Cultural Foundation, has graced us with her presence tonight. Welcome to you, warm welcome. Thank you to all the people present here, of course, and at home, our guests, the audience, to all people in and around the Balie who've worked hard to make this forum happen. All the program editors of the Balie have worked very hard for a year. Thank you to the board of the Forum of the European Cultural Foundation, of course, and thanks to all other partners that have worked with us. And thank you, of course, Museum Kranenburg and Claudia Jongster and the Jonas Stichting for allowing us to show this backdrop here tonight. Claudia Jongster, can I ask you to join me? Renowned Dutch artist, your works often explore the themes of nature, ecology, and the interconnectedness of humans and nature and environment we live in. And your dogged interest and persuasive manner in which you point out sort of the connection between everything we live with and we live on and we make things with and art is very, very inspiring and made you one of the leading figures, I would say, in the contemporary world of contemporary art. So very welcome to you. This piece, I phoned you and I said, I need one of your works of art to embellish this conversation on empire and environment. And he said, oh, well, we have to take this one.
Guernica de la Ecologia. The work is made 2.5 years ago. We have a studio, workspace, fields, farms in the northern part of the Netherlands. I worked for a long time in Amsterdam and then moved to the north.
Yeah, to Friesland.
Yes. Yeah. And this work is made in a small village. We have a team of interdisciplinary people, intergenerational. Our youngest team member is 19, the oldest 82. Mm-hmm. So we learn a lot from each other. It's very intercultural, and what you see here is all made from nature, especially wool. I've been working with wool for the last nearly 25 years, coming from fast fashion industry. And this is wool from the oldest Northern European breed. It's called Drent Heat. So Northern Europe was famous for wool for a long time. But since we have lost valuing wool in the Netherlands, we burn every year 1.5 million kilos of wool.
You burn?
We burn, we waste it, because we have no industry left. Since
we have no cloth industry left. There's seats up in the end. Nice that you're here. They're up and so. Mm-hmm.
So losing a sense of tactility and losing a sense of natural materiality. It starts also in education, of course, in learning. So this piece is made from I don't consider it as waste wool. For me, it's very precious. I mean, wool kept us warm for centuries. People lived in wool in these nomadic shelters. But since a lot of clothing is made from polyesters, we don't appreciate the material. It's all handmade also. Handmade processes are very slow. It's on a human scale. You see the handprint. We have master dyers, we have master spinners, we have master weavers. And what is very interesting about this piece is, as in the work of Picasso, it's without color. But it means in this work it's with every color in, because the famous Burgundian black, the darker pieces, if you were a master dyer in the Middle Ages, you could use and you could master every skill of dyeing. So it meant you could work with walnut, with indigo. In Europe we have woad, and with madder root. But you have to wait, for example, 5 years for a root to generate the color. It's the color of Rembrandt and Vermeer. So do we still have that patience?
The time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And do we still are anxious, you know, because if you order a tapestry, or if you commission us for a tapestry, it can happen that either we're out of wool because we make these installations, or we have to wait for a year's crop from biodynamic farmers in the Netherlands or in Europe to produce the colors.
Yeah, because you only use biodynamic materials.
Land-based dyes.
But why did you call it Guernica? Guernica is, of course, Picasso's masterpiece, you could say.
Yeah.
From 1937, the attack of the fascists on the little village in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So why is Guernica de la Ecologia?
Because I think it's an attack, I mean, this is a metaphor for an attack on the earth qualities, lost knowledge, indigenous knowledge. I mean, I live in Friesland now for the last 22 years, and we saw landscape also, you know, changing. I mean, especially plant-based colors. I mean, this was economy. For centuries, there was a currency either in wool, in spices, pigments, and since we lost that, I mean, you could easily bring that back into, you know, into our landscape. So that's why we encourage farmers to grow these crops for color, but we need, of course, people, markets, you know, to digest these colors.
Yeah, because you make gardens in which you plant the dyes and the spices and the materials to work with. And so there's farmers involved in there's a whole gardens behind those, and the landscape of sheep behind this piece of art.
Yeah, we work especially on places where we feel there is a potential for transformation. So, for example, Spain is a new place where we are working now. In Navarra, farmers very willing to transform their farmers' structure. So it's about not only about growing crops, but also about biodiversity, but also it's a community. If you make these colors, I mean, it's like, the farm is not a traditional farm anymore. So you can invite scientists. The recipes come from Middle Ages. We work together with a lot of universities. They show us, they enclose the recipes, and in these recipes you can literally see circular economy. Alchemists from the 15th century would use everything. There was no waste. It was precious. You could use everything. There was a lot of creativity. People were very inventive because they had to.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope that people would? How do you hope people would respond to your work?
Before this work, in 2018, I made another work. It was, this is the second, there will be a third. It was woven skin, and it traveled also all over the world to New York Climate Week, and we hoped to engage, that we could, like this here, this today, panel discussions, and then you hope an imprint or an impulse, etc. But the impulse was always very temporarily. So now with Guernica, we actually are working together with people, and we construct our new textile communities, Spain and the Netherlands, Egypt, where there is a potential for transformation in a community setting. We try to help.
Thank you very much, Claudia Jongstra, for explaining and for allowing us to. And now, of course, I would like to invite Peter Frankopan, Professor Frankopan, to join us. You just made it flying in you've been all over the world for the past sort of weeks, and teaching at Oxford because it's term time, isn't it?
Yes.
So how do you do that?
A lot of coffee. So thank you to Case for giving me ready-to-go coffee. You know, it's such a pleasure to be back here at Balie. I was here in December to talk about Putin and the war in Ukraine, and you know, I love coming to talk to clever, engaged audiences. Yuri is a great friend and a brilliant man, as you all know. But when we were outside, he said, "Yeah, it was a great audience when you came before, but the one this evening are even cleverer, even smarter, but maybe very gentle." But let's see. But
actually, I said that. Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry to scare you. Yeah.
So look, I mean, some of the work that I do, as you know, has a regional focus. You know, my work before this has primarily been about Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, China, India, Pakistan, places that turns out are much more important than historians thought, because we never pay them any attention in the way we wrote about history. But these are all areas that are highly climate exposed. I mean, as you'll probably know, yesterday there were 3 people killed on the border between Afghanistan and Iran to do with water disputes.
That was the reason?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, all the glaciers in Tajikistan will be melted, will be gone by 2050. It's irreversible. Himalayas is slightly different, the networks of glaciers there, and you know, that produces set of consequences. So I was just in Pakistan a good friend of mine is the climate change minister.
You were just in Pakistan, like
a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Senator Sherry Rehman has just been named one of Times 100 People of the Year. Incredibly thoughtful, clever, brave woman working on climate change. And in Pakistan, you know, you'll have remembered it from the news last September. At least, I mean, the reports of exactly how many people were displaced vary, but somewhere between 7 million, maybe as many as 30 million people, $30 billion of damage in a country where only 10% of that was insured. And climate events hurt the poorest people in society most, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And it's a real challenge for democracies. But in those kinds of scenarios, trying to plan ahead, trying to work out what kind of mitigation, what kind of interventions, what kind of hope there is, it's really important. And, you know, as you know, as a fellow Oxford historian, I didn't realize that historians could be involved in these discussions.
Yeah, that's actually very encouraging that they ask historians to come and lecture them on, you know, what to do.
Yeah, you know,
and treat them as prophets.
Amazingly, you can learn things from the past. Those experiences are really important.
Maybe you could, yeah. You've written a new book. You were here last time. We talked also about the Silk Roads, a new history of the world, in which you persuasively challenged Eurocentric narratives.
My publisher's here in the audience, so make sure that, there we go.
But now, this just came out, The Earth Transformed, an untold history. And now you're even challenging the human-centric narrative of history by talking about the stage. Talking about the environment.
That was a great quote.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out I can write well as well. That said, I think it's really important that we, you know, particularly when we think about history, all the history we teach children is about other people. And there are lots of good reasons for that, lots of morals and stories. We tend to pick on the great leaders and the horrific leaders as kind of morality tales. But we don't integrate that into the natural world. We don't teach children in the classroom where things come from, how to grow things. You know, as Claudia was saying, you know, how the fact that Holland in the Netherlands is famous as being one of the greenest countries on earth. You know, the recycling, the bicycling, the encouragement, you know, with the natural world. You tend not to want to build a city below sea level like you do Amsterdam. Requires ingenuity, but 1.5 million tons of wool burnt every year. You know, the wastage that goes on through the farm gate in developed economies, it's criminal. And it's criminal not just because it's environmentally damaging, it's criminal because there are better uses that we can make of our resources. And those circular economies, again, it's something that Claudia just said, you know, this was something which we forgot. All societies before us were very good at making use of all their resources, but we live in a world where we think money is infinite. We can keep spending and there are no consequences.
The planet is infinite, we seem to think as well. Yeah,
it's bad for democracy. Yeah. I mean, that's also why we're here. It's very bad for democracy because at some point, if you're spending more than you're earning, the bank asks for its money back, right? The natural world solves this in a way that humans become the problem rather than the solution. And, you know, we should be mindful of that. That's why we're here in Amsterdam and not in Uruk. Or other cities that were once the Amsterdams of the past. It's to do with...
It's fascinating to read about, and I've been thinking about many things. If you read the book, and it's one of them is how come that hardly ever. And you're a historian, so you've and there's an impressive list in the back of the literature and stuff like.
Actually, they're online. I put all my footnotes online because there are nearly 4,000 of them. It would be 250 pages a book on its own. And as a scholar, as you know, it's really helpful to be able to cut and paste. If you find a reference, then you want to go and read it rather than type it all out. So we put it online. But
why is it that mostly we never ever thought about putting the climate and the environmental circumstances on which the empires of the world developed? And you're starting at the dawn of Homo sapiens, and then come to our day in 700 pages. But why is it new that?
It's not new.
It's not new. It's not.
Almost the very first texts when humans developed writing systems were about environmental concerns. The book of Genesis, God created the earth. He created a perfect conditions. He created the mountains, the oceans, the animals, and then the last moment put in human beings, which even if you are, whether you're fundamentalist Christian or not, that's broadly geological history. It just took 4.5 billion years for humans to arrive. But that's more or less about right. There's a kind of ecological biosphere where God puts you in a garden and says, you have everything you need. Obey my commandments, do what you're told, and everyone will be happy. You have one job.
And Genesis is one of the oldest texts we have, huh? Not maybe
and
oldest, but
Genesis,
one
of course, is a part of the Torah, so it's sacred in Judaism, of course in Christianity, and also in Islam. We forget these Abrahamic faiths have all common roots. That's probably quite useful to remind ourselves from time to time. And all of these three great faiths constantly talk about the importance of preserving the world as God gave it to us, by not just behaving in a moral way that reflects our goodness and our kindness, that's human behavior, but also in how we engage with the natural world. When Adam and Eve eat from the forbidden tree, the only job they had, don't eat anything else, but just not this one, the punishment for humans and their descendants is environmental and ecological. They are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they're kicked out of paradise, and made to work the land that is difficult. It is hard. You have floods, you have famine, you have food shortage, you eat things that are poisonous that kill you. And that idea about...
So the punishment for transgressive behavior or for unethical behavior is a harsh environment.
Yes.
It's an environment which has been depleted.
And this is the same in Mesopotamian faith systems, in the Nile Valley, in, so far as we can tell, the Indus Valley. The reason why there are fertility symbols, the reasons why there are interventions, the reason why there are developments of priesthoods is to commune with, well, the skies, because that's where the sun beats down on you and it doesn't rain, or the floods come from because there's too much. So you find the flood of Noah, again, in these three great religions, but also it's written in Egyptian chronicles and in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Mesopotamian texts about a cataclysmic pluvial event that obviously was hugely traumatic and was written down to say the reason why this happened was because of the way that humans were choosing to live. And so that warning about how to engage with the environment is old, and okay, that's maybe 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, but even 3,000 years ago, you have Greek writers like Hesiod who say humans must be very careful not to cut down the forests, because when they do that, they change rainfall patterns.
They change rainfall patterns?
Yeah. If you overexploit the land won't produce anymore what you thought it could. And the concerns about hypersalinity, so if you sweat the fields, if you don't let them rest, if you plant when they bake down, if you don't allow the soils to regenerate, then your yields fall. And in fact, in some cases, fall catastrophically and irreparably. We find, for example, in the great Abbasid Empire, the great Arab empire that more or less spreads from Spain right the way through North Africa, through the Middle East to Central Asia, splits into two, the Umayyads in the west and the Abbasids.
So to the stance from
the
Spain to the
yields
stance,
of crops falls by about 80% in the course of about 100 years. Exhaustion.
That's rather quick.
Well, look at our olive oil prices in Europe today, here in May, June. First day of June, I knew I'd get that wrong. First day of June 2023, more or less the olive oil and the olive production in places like Spain is non-feasible this season because of the heat and the baking of the soil, not this year or last year, but over the course of several years. And that creates all sorts of things. It creates price pressures, creates inflation, it creates shortages, it changes where jobs and where manpower are needed. It cascades into a whole set of different political and social consequences too. And sometimes that's because of bad luck. I write in my book, sometimes there are these long-range plans and patterns that change the ecological lottery, but sometimes it's because of our success. So, for example, creating cities, it's great for us to exchange ideas, to come to Balie. It took me 12 minutes, thank God, to get here from Central on a tram. Otherwise, I'd still be walking here. My pilot was late. My pilot, that sounds like I've got a personal plane. The plane was late. Sorry, the plane was late. I know the Dutch don't like show-offs. Yeah, the plane with hundreds of other people on it was late. Yeah. I think that when you have cities, that they're great for interactions, they're great for ideas to be exchanged, they're great to go and buy whatever you want within 500 meters of here, food, clothes, etc. Turns out the cities are deadly because they consume. You throw things away, someone picks it up, and we don't think about where it gets recycled or who buy, to the point that we now wake up in a world in 2023 where there are 40 microplastic particles for every cubic meter in every ocean on Earth. All of us have microplastics in our bloodstream. Unborn children in their placentas, the mothers, have rising levels of microplastics because of the way in which we use detergent and we spend things around us, because we are both uneducated, we don't know this, and also we don't get regulated by our governments who underperform, which is a danger, again, for our theme of democracy, and also because we have grown up in a world, particularly in the last 30 years, we talked a bit about this last time, of when the Berlin Wall came down, that world of fear that you and I grew up in, which was highly environmental, acid rain, the ozone layer, this was something that scared us all, which changed the way in which fridges, freezers, underarm deodorants were used, didn't seem to affect us too badly. That ozone layer in 1987, the Montreal Agreement, will mean that because that's been kept, the ozone layer will close by around about 2018, about 30 or 40 years. Great success. And there would have been greater environmental protections that were being talked about by the Soviet Union and the US, but because the Berlin Wall fell, because we thought that the Russians were going to be great and just buy lots of property and yachts, and there would never be a risk that they would pose to our security, let anyone else's.
Become nice citizens.
Right, and then the acceleration of China and its growth. It turns out these last 30 years were hugely damaging. So I was thinking on the way here, David Wallace Wells, the great New York Times journalist, says his point is that 50% of the world's carbon has been burnt since the first episode of Seinfeld was broadcast. That doesn't mean, Seinfeld doesn't mean too much. So I
50% means a lot. Yeah.
50% means a lot, right?
Seinfeld less.
So I thought, well, how would I explain that to a Dutch audience? So I thought it's about 45% has been burnt since Dennis Bergkamp scored that goal against Argentina in the 1998 World Cup. That amazing, everyone knows that goal.
Everybody knows it.
Possibly the greatest goal in the history of World Cup football. 45% of all the carbon we put into the atmosphere was since that point. And that process of acceleration means that since my year of my birth in 1971, between us, by burning carbon and the way we live, we have injected equivalent of 40 zettajoules, or the equivalent, maybe easier, 25 billion Hiroshima bombs of heat into the oceans, right? Last year, we injected 10 zettajoules into the oceans. That's enough energy to boil 700 million kettles per second for every minute, day of the year of 2022. That is from the heat we generate, from the way in which we live. But because we can't see it, because we can't think about it, we are disconnected from the environment. We can't see where wool comes from. We can't think about fabrics, synthetics. It's just they're quite cheap, and surely if there was a problem, someone would say so. But it turns out that blindness is very dangerous when you suddenly wake up and realize that there's a problem. So these hyperconnections have been great for the world's poor. It's been, the last 30 years, fantastic for the poorest people in society, but it's not been even in the way in which this has been distributed. And that, again, comes back to our challenge of what does that mean for democracy? Because not everybody's equal in this world, unfortunately, whether we try to. So history teaches you, I think, lots of these lessons, but one of the key ones is that almost every single writer you can think of in the Sanskrit tradition, in India, in early Chinese literatures, intervening with the gods, it's all about how do we keep a sustainable, ecological future, because if we don't, we die. We die because we can't feed ourselves. We die because when we can't feed ourselves, we are more immune systems are more compromised and disease spreads. When those things happen, states start to break down. There's instability. So it's not just we like the world to be green and clean. It's that if we don't keep it in balance and in harmony, there are consequences.
And you...
Am I talking too fast?
No, I don't think so. Is he talking too fast? No.
It's the coffee.
And must be the coffee.
Firing me up.
But also probably the topic. So you're saying it's not new at all the way, to look at our civilization and development of civilizations, successive civilizations in the context of the environment we're in. The only thing is that Hesiodot wrote about it. Actually, von Humboldt already wrote about it when he explored South America. You have great examples of Gilgamesh, one of the the earliest literary text in the world, older, I think, even than Genesis, where there's this connection with the environment, Enkidu, the wild man, lamenting that they're killing beasts and cutting down the forests.
So one of the very first, it's not the first law code, Hammurabi, but it's the most famous early law code. It's very clear that if you cut down another man's orchard, that's ecocide. That's what we think about today is something that new for the United Nations, that deliberate devastation of ecological environments through mining, as Russians have done in eastern Ukraine, for example, or cutting down of forests, or even globally we're responsible for environmental collapse of Amazon, Southeast Asian rainforests and so on. But this is something which some of the very, very earliest texts were warning that there are dangers and consequences, and it's all to do with people's understanding that there are finite limits to what we can do. I mean, I think there's an interesting reason why the first early cities are not found in Amsterdam or London, Paris.
Now, you mentioned Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley, big city.
Indus, Mesopotamia, Nile, Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And these are places that are very attractive to live in, but they are prescribed. Either side of these plains, you have the Sahara Desert, which is not such a good place to live or survive. It's not impossible. Nomadic cultures can do it, but you can't support large populations. But so you have this kind of pressure of attraction, of constant population increases, and then you reach a point where the machine struggles because there are too many mouths to feed, and it's quite hard to be sustainable. So in Mesopotamia, for example, one of the first things that happens is that all the trees get cut down. And
because it was called the Fertile Crescent, of course.
Very fertile because it has reliable rainfall and water. And human beings, if we break down history into its blocks, calories, can you find enough food? Balance of protein and other foods too, water, and energy sources. And wood is not just, of course, to keep us warm at night, but it's, we need wood or heat sources to break protein down so we can digest food. We need heat sources to make metal. We need heat sources to make glass. We need heat sources not usually to make bricks. If it's in Mesopotamia, it's really hot, then you can get away with it. But you find trade networks establishing themselves into what's now India 5,000 years ago, bringing wood. And wood, as everybody knows in this room, we probably know in this room, it's quite heavy. And it's expensive to transport heavy things. My world of Silk Roads, when you're transporting small amounts of spices, silks, things that are high margin and rare, gold, lapis lazuli, then it's very profitable. But bulk goods, it's tricky. And so again, when I write about the Roman Empire, the thing that I was most interested in is how lucky Rome was climatologically. So Rome goes from being a kind of an important military state with all of the things that means about gender, social class, physiques, all the kind of things that are very interesting, I think, in societies. The reward for men to beat each other up rather than to read and write. The transformation happens partly because of volcanic eruptions in what's now Alaska. A volcano called Okmok sends large amounts of debris and particles up into the atmosphere that has an impact on photosynthesis globally, right? It changes the... you want to stop me? I'm mid-flow.
No.
Like a bird, you're going to shoot me now.
Go ahead.
As I flap my wings.
It's much better if you finish your thoughts because we can profit from it.
All right, you sure?
Yeah.
I can tell. Okay, I'm doing. Let me interview you. But anyway, the long and short of it is the Nile floods fail, inflation, cost of living, all the local elites in Egypt who've been kept away from power by a single dynasty called the Ptolemies, descendants of a Greek general, whose ruler at that time is a very, very skillful, highly adept politician called Cleopatra. And she reaches outside to stabilize her kingdom from all the pressure from within, and makes a deal with Mark Antony, who'd be a good bet. He's good with animals, he's good with kids, he's got a good bedside manner, he's popular with the army.
Yeah, nice guy.
Nice guy. And they get outmaneuvered by a weasel of a figure called Octavian, who gets renamed Augustus, manages to corner them in whichever way they die, with snake bites or whatever it might be. And Rome then captures Egypt and its wheat and grain plantation complex. And that single capture, when Augustus dies, he's renamed Augustus by the grateful Senate, they make him emperor, the powers of the emperor. When he dies, he says, I found the city built in brick and I left it in marble, because that extraction, that empire that was about ecological exploitation and capture of natural resources meant that the cost of food, the cost of calories, the amount of wealth that flowed into Rome, turned Rome into a global empire.
It was a grain basket.
All empires are about ecological exploitation. Dutch, British, Roman, you name it. Facebook, Amazon, it's always about exploitation of the natural world and its resources at the lowest possible price.
It's always about capturing the grain basket somewhere and capturing Sicily. Sicily was growing grain. Sicily was, highly contested between the right. Romans and the Carthaginians. You're saying an empire is always about exploitation of the natural world, extraction.
All that an empire is a political center that expands its peripheries to bring more things back to the center.
Yeah.
That's the job of an empire. Yeah. Or a state or a kingdom. It's the same thing. It's about a central point of control that brings things from abroad. Yeah, and that can be done through trade, it can be done through paying prices, it can be done through severe exploitation, slavery and suffering. It can be done through market economies, but it's always about widening the net of goods that you can bring. So, the Dutch, it's no surprise, the places of most interest to the Dutch Republic in the 1580s onwards were sugar plantations, were spice islands, were textiles and fabrics, and then quite often the challenge is for these merchants to work out how do we translate our nice earning position into a monopoly that we can force the prices down even cheaper. How do we then take control completely of these systems? And then there's a very difficult balance about oppressions, racisms, all the things that come with every empire, right?
With imperialism in general.
Yes. Yeah. The reason that the Dutch were interested in the parts of the world they were interested in, the British, the parts they were interested in, the Romans, the parts they were interested in, was not like children with crayons on a map going, I'd like to have more land. It's always about specific ecological extraction.
And resources thereafter and ecological extraction. Yeah.
Always, that's the raison d'être of an empire.
And that's the same, you describe it as well, but that's the same for the Achaemenid Empire of the Persians, it's the same for the Babylonians, for the Mesopotamian conquerors.
Interestingly, and it's something you said in your introduction, Yuri, it's not the same for us all in Europe. When you talked about Europe and legacies of slavery and oppression, that doesn't mean something to someone from Romania or Greece.
No.
Where's their role in transatlantic slave trades? And where's their engagement with race and exploitation the same way that we feel it here in Northern Europe and Western Europe? And we need to be very careful, I think, about when we think and talk about Europe in the same way that, we sort of know what we mean by Europe. Mm-hmm. It's a geographical thing. We don't quite know where it ends. Yeah. Is some of Russia?
Edges are vague.
Belarus.
Is New Zealand part of Europe or not?
I mean, just in things of looking at a map. Yeah. We're defined by thinking this thing we're familiar with, we think of always a map. And to North Africa, it's different. Even though climatologically, linguistically, ethnically, its similarities with Spain are a lot closer genetically, everywhere you look at it, food they eat, etc., Morocco and Spain, than Spain and Finland, eating reindeer. So I think that those ways in which we think we're all in the same boat together, we need to be really clear about these discussions about gender, about race, about legacies, about histories, about imperialism, where most of the countries in Central Eastern Europe are victims of imperialism, not protagonists. And in the last 200 or 300 years, that's very different to the Western side, which is on a different journey.
And that's why I quoted Oksana Zabushko, who is a Ukrainian writer,
Right.
Exactly that point, of course, because she points out, that it might be wiser to divide between former empires and former colonies. And you're saying the same thing in some way, because loads of democracies in Europe, Eastern Europe or Central Europe, were colonized by the Turks or the Russians, of course.
Well, let's be honest, or by the Austrians,
or by
the Germans. Mm-hmm. It's not just other people with different languages and people we don't like today. It's not just Erdogan and his ancestors or Putin and his ancestors. Mm-hmm. We in Europe, in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, the scale of slaughter because of people's religious beliefs, masking the grasp for political power, was absolutely astonishing. The number of women that suffered in the 17th century on being tried for witchcraft as a result of attempts for people to take religious power, it's almost inexplicable. But I think we think about history because of we don't have a context. I mean, it's a word you said just now, we don't have a historical context because for us, we laugh at the Americans. Americans think history began in 1900. But for us, our histories really don't go beyond the formation of the Dutch Republic or the British Empire. It's sort of interesting, these Crusader knights, but they're sort of nothing to do with us, and it was all a bit muscular. But we don't think about ecology, we don't think about climate, we don't think about what differences these things made, and we don't think about how people exploited each other in the past in deep ways, and who those winners and losers were in history.
But then you described something also very interesting. You just mentioned it briefly. The extraction, the empires are built on the idea that you need to extract resources from a widening circle and actually exploit it and maybe exhaust it. And there's many examples in the book of a culture or an empire which exhausts itself. I never knew that, but you wrote that, I think Hume or Locke wrote that there's something strange with the climate, because in ancient times, during the Roman times, the Tiber, the river flowing through Rome, was freezing over, very often. And the Black Sea was, according to the Greeks, and Ovidius was, you quote here, frozen over normally every winter. So you say either that proves that he's a liar, or that the climate did change.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Florida in the 1600s, Spaniards wrote back to the King of Spain repeatedly saying, this place is absolutely bloody freezing, we can't grow anything here. And for us, Florida is a place where Trump lives, top up his suntan, and you grow oranges, and you have golf courses, and it's a very nice climate most of the year. I suspect in 20 or 30 years, Florida will be a place where only idiots own property because they're uninsurable because of the scale of the storms that come through. So Lloyd's, the big insurance broker, the chief executive said a couple of months ago that he felt that in the next decade, Florida real estate will be uninsurable. In fact, yesterday, insurance companies in California have said they will not insure new homes in California. Full stop. Full stop, because of the risks of forest fires, water shortages, and ecological risks. And that would make you think, if I'm sitting in Amsterdam, I want to know where my pension is invested. That looks to me that suggests there's a problem about the American real estate market, about valuations, and about shocks that will come through. And, if your pension pot goes down by 25%, that's maybe you can cope with that, maybe you can't. But lack of knowledge is not the reason to blame for that. So, I read a report a couple of months ago that's not in my book, but suggests that US real estate is overvalued by several $1 trillion because, and in fact, amazingly, people are not moving away from Florida or from California. They're not moving away from the bottom third of the US, where
they're moving towards it.
They're moving towards it. Yeah. In the southern third of the United States, there are going to be 125 million people living in a world where we think the climate in the next 20 years will be above 40 degrees centigrade, 125 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 months of the year. And that would look to me like not a great long-term plan. It would seem to me not a great long-term plan to move to Saudi Arabia, where there's not one single lake, not one single river, and there's a reliance on being able to beat nature through technology. And you can beat nature through technology. In Saudi Arabia, currently, the Saudis burn 750,000 barrels of oil per day on air conditioning. Current projections are that air conditioning units currently produce about 10% of global emissions, that the number of air conditioning units before 2030, so 7 years' time, is going to treble or quadruple, right? So, and those are going to accelerate our energy needs, and we're going to need to power things in one way or another.
So once you're actually describing that once an empire or a civilization moves over a piece of land, it burns it. It leaves it bare. That's what happened in Mesopotamia. That's what in the Indus Valley happened. That's what.
Not always. Sometimes it's the market is a different way. So what happens is you have the pioneers who go and plant and enslave and grow crops which are high margin profit for example, sugar or cotton or tobacco. But then because those expand, the prices fall, right? And then the landowner is making less profit, so they shift in what they're looking for. But like that ecological boundaries, and my quote about the stage that we live on, even the United States, the line between the Confederates and the Union, but between the kind of bad guys and the good guys, or between the pro-democrats and the slave owners, was not just bad people, good people, or political views. It's an ecological boundary. To the south of this line are rich fields that are the result of past climate changes. The fields of the United States in the south were once underwater, and the reason they're black and dark, like the fields of Ukraine, which are also underwater for millions of years, is that the plankton, the animal life and the vegetation that died made these exceptionally rich, because as the sea levels changed over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, this made them perfect for exploitation for cash crops. To the north of the Mason-Dixon line, where the Union was, this soil wouldn't support tobacco and cotton and et cetera, but grow wheat. And wheat is a much more democratic model of labor, because you need not very much labor, but for a few days a year to harvest. And so you can distribute rights in a different way to enslaving people for the long term. So that boundary is ecological. It's to do with the soils. Ironically, it's also to do with disease environments. So malaria flourished to the south of this line. And that meant that the turnover of humans was very high, because people die when they get malaria still. And that also meant that, and I write about it in my book, the thing that I had no idea about, and it's amazing research done by colleagues of mine, that the price is being paid for human beings. I mean, it's such a grotesque thing to have to write about and think about, were much higher in places in West Africa where there was a genetic mutation that provided anti-inflammatory resistance to diseases like malaria. So in some populations in West Africa, when you're infected with malaria, you have 90% survival rates. And people from these regions, people didn't understand why they live longer, but that's correlated in the fact they attracted higher prices by slave owners, because they'd live for longer. So that whole distribution of populations from Africa into the so-called New World to produce money and profits that then didn't just bring money back to landowners here, it gave us a calorie boost. We could all drink tea that came from Asia, fizz it up with sugar gave us the boost that allowed us to then focus on all sorts of other things too. And that level of inequality now is an important one. Some of the worlds that I write about here in the modern world, is about the fact that 50% of the world's population today experiences severe water shortage for at least a month of the year. So 3.5 billion people, billion children already at direct consequences of climatic changes. And those 50% of the population on Earth, the poorest ones, have the same carbon footprint as the top 1%, right? And those inequalities are ones that are structural, that are a huge part of why we're finding it so hard to move forward with climate agreements, because you can see why parts of the world that are most at risk of climate change and are least responsible for it feel that it's not right that they're left out to dry. So the energy consumption of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, today, as a full population, it's a lot of people, all of Nigeria, all of West Africa, is lower than the city of New York, right, in terms of its energy consumption. And that scale of how do we therefore balance the fact that infrastructure investment, schools, hospitals, clean water, how do we get to a point where we can live more sustainably in a greener world and put our hands in our pockets to be equalizing rather than letting the rich win? But that's why we can talk about ecological imperialism in today's world too, where the strong get stronger and the weak stay weak, and 20 million people in the Horn of Africa today at severe risk of starvation and famine. But we don't do a great deal about that.
Reading about the empires you describe, it struck me that if you look at the landscape of the Soviet Union and you look at the landscape of the American empire, and they were both global empires, and you describe how they kept each other sort of in a balance. But the landscape they created, the rampant capitalist American global empire and the USSR, this huge Asian empire, the landscape they produced in Ukraine partly or in the Midwest, these huge farms where they were sort of the same landscapes. It suddenly dawned on me, we had two world empires with a total different ideological makeup, but they exploited the soil in the same way. They ended up using, drying up their ILC, being as bad as for the environment, both in the same sort of exploitative way, which sort of struck me that, hey, maybe they were much more the same.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't go...
Then ideologically you would say.
I wouldn't go quite that far, Yuri. I mean, look, I think that, I mean, in fact, for example, in the United States, Clean Air Act passed in 1980, and in fact, in the 1970s, did a lot for to introduce major environmental protections in the United States for air quality, for use of the environment. And, by and large, I would feel that institutions in the West, however much we might kick them, can be quite good at intervening and stopping bad practices. And that is the story of the US, obviously reinforced by a justice system that can punish polluters and so on. So that's been quite efficient. In the US, for sure, one of the things, the story of global agriculture in particular, has been mechanization. And so the need for fewer or smaller manpower that's helped drive urbanization. It's helped take people away from the land. Yeah. Because if you have a combine harvester that's automated that can do the work, then people get freed into the cities. And that is, of course, a challenge in itself. I mean, today, at the moment, in the world, we are adding, globally, 3 million new city residents per week, right? And people who move to the cities put pressure on infrastructure. That's a lot of flushing lavatories, or not flushing lavatories, or waste to deal with. That's a lot of people washing their hands, brushing their teeth, cooking, buying, eating. And cities they can be very dangerous places. And, on a good day, there's nothing nice than being in Amsterdam, bumping into your friends in the streets, meeting to have a beer in the park, reading each other poetry. But, as it turns out, well, some of you must do that. Don't laugh. With my lovely poet friends. But it turns out, as we've just learnt, that the danger of living in a city is if someone in the apartment next to you sneezes, there's a chance you're going to get coronavirus.
No.
And diseases spread in cities very quickly, and things can collapse in cities very fast. So, and again, the worlds I work on, because we don't pay any attention to them, there are 9 cities in the US with a population of more than 1 million people, maybe now a 10th one, but 9 million people, with 1 million people. In China, there are 156 cities with more than 1 million people, right? And I can promise you, if we did a quiz in here, no one could name more than the top 30, right? Even just recognize their names. These are places we got no idea. And cities are consumers of energy because they're intensive in terms of their productions of manufactured goods and the consumption of foods. It cuts us off from the countryside. It helps generate waste. And because we are spoilt by those choices that were, part of the American dream in the 20th century was, and I write about it in my book, one of the real competitions between the US and the Soviet Union was showing Khrushchev, when he went to the United States, showing him regular American supermarkets, with almost endless varieties of apples, all perfectly shiny and looking perfect. And Mikoyan, who was the premier at the time, saying, we don't have this stuff in the Soviet Union. We need to change how we do things. And Khrushchev, and then was part of his demise, was to try to boost the Soviet agricultural system, to introduce maize in particular, massive farms that turned out to not work. And eventually in the early 1960s, the Soviet Union had to petition the United States to send them wheat. Yeah. And that was such a disgrace that it undermined all confidence in the Soviet system. So I think that one of those ideas that this is what a world of plenty looks like is being able to walk into Albert Heijn and seeing so many different choices of butter, so many different perfect kinds of food, that the waste we have, Claudia mentioned the wool. In the United Kingdom, we throw away 18 million meals per day from farms. For goods that are crops that are grown and not deemed worthy to go to the supermarket to be sold, either because they don't look right or because farmers don't want to sell their milk or their beef or their eggs below cost, because that's what they're made to do sometimes by supermarkets, but even now we're talking about in the United Kingdom, by governments trying to force price controls on these staple diets. And that's a criminal waste of ecological resources. So I'll stop there. Globally, we grow between us 930 million tons of food. This is a report that came out last year. 930 million of tons of food that are grown, taken to shops, markets, supermarkets, taken home, refrigerated or otherwise, looked at and thrown away. And that amount of food would be the equivalent of 23 million 40-ton trucks, those big trucks you see on the motorways here. 23 million of them, if you put them bumper to bumper, would circle the earth 7 times. That's food that we grow,
and throw away.
Waste and throw away.
Yeah.
And we live in a world where global poverty has got better, but here in Amsterdam, we could go for a walk, all of us in this audience, and within a kilometre of here, I can promise you can find a lot of people who are hungry. In London, one of the richest cities on earth, we have more than 100,000 children who go to school every day hungry. The Felix Project supplies, set up by friends of mine when their beautiful, gorgeous, lovely son tragically died age 14 in his memory, produced 75,000 breakfasts per day for hungry children. And those breakdowns of society, again, I know we're here to talk about democracy, those are really damaging, those inequalities, those ways in which we are thoughtless about how we treat the environment and think that the environment will just keep on giving. And, I'm a little bit concerned that at some point, a bit like borrowing money from the bank, one day, a knock on the door says, you now need to pay back. And if you're burning, if you're wasting, if you're throwing away, then you're not very good custodians.
But you just pointed out that the American system, though also maybe exploiting the environment, at least can punish people who pollute the environment, and that's a little bit better maybe than the drying up of the RLC version of the Soviet economy and exploiting, extracting. But if you mention these sort of numbers, are imperialistic way of thinking that we get resources, and you point out that we have an Earth of 1.6 Earth. We need 1.6 Earth now today.
We're spending 1.6 Earth resources. Yeah, it's a British government report. Yeah.
Every year, you write towards the end of the book, which is again this sort of same system you described earlier in our conversation, where we think that we can get in resources from somewhere and to widen our circle and get it in, and so I'm just wondering whether, after writing these 700 pages and doing much more research, I was reading the speech of Frans Timmermans, a recent speech of Frans Timmermans, I think at Ghent, where he starts his whole speech with your book, trying to say that we need to reform the European Union, we need to do the Green Deal, because, as you eloquently point out, the planet is finite, and if we keep thinking in this sort of imperialistic way, do you think actually that a European empire, which it is, it's a huge country at least, do you think that we? And he actually goes as far as to say, well, the raison d'être for the Union becomes something like our environmental future. First we said, there's the reason for the Union is no more war, never again, nie wieder. But and so he changes that into, and what struck me was that he actually quoted your book. Do you think that's feasible for an empire?
Yeah. I mean, the United States emissions are down by 25% since 2005. Mm-hmm. Right, that's pretty good. Here in Europe, I mean, one of the reasons we left, I say we, the Brits, left, one of the reasons was because we didn't like the light bulbs that the European Union insisted we all have.
Light bulbs.
These LED light bulbs.
I didn't know that. I thought it was migrants, but...
migrants, but wrong-shaped bananas, all that. I mean, for use of a better word, and my coffee's kicked in, the bullshit stories we were all told. Mm-hmm. But the light bulbs, the LEDs, was one of the things that, why should we have governments telling us what we should do? Turns out that saved vast amounts of energy. In fact, if we scaled LED across into other parts outside Europe in a maybe we wouldn't call it imperialism, but in a benign way of making these things cheaper and accessible, we would save about $40 billion worth of energy production every year, and that would save 320 million tons of carbon going into the atmosphere every year, if we could have LED bulbs in the developing world.
Just simple, yeah.
Correct. So our mandate could be not just how do we look after ourselves in our pretty kingdom in Europe, or a beautiful empire, which we don't do a bad job. No one really in the Netherlands opens their car window and chucks stuff out into the street. Most people are quite good at looking after their neighbourhood. They are quite aware of it. I think we are, humans around the world are generally quite good in their behaviours. But we need to have more joined up thinking. I mean, as it happens, again, and I'm not going to do this as a quiz, which I would like to do, since the war in Ukraine started, or the invasion of Ukraine, I should say, by Russia, we've had this energy shock all over Europe. Right?
Yeah.
That has accelerated lots of ideas about green energy.
Yeah, suddenly gas became very expensive.
In the United Kingdom, since the first day that the Russians invaded Ukraine, 24th February 2022, we have constructed a total in the UK of land wind turbines, 2.
2?
In the last 15 months. Right? That produces 1 megawatt of energy. Ukraine, a country that's been invaded, has built a wind farm near Melitopol, about 50 kilometers from the front line, that produces 114 megawatts, right, in the same time frame. So we need to be more honest about what we need to do and how to do it. You know, we have a cabinet minister today on my way here while sitting on the runway waiting to come here. And by the way, flights aren't that bad, climate change. There's a bit about that. If we change the altitudes of the 2% worst performing flights, we would reduce emissions from airline traffic by 80%.
80%.
Very easy. AI can do this. It's one flick. And the cost of this is almost negligible. Some joined up thinking. But you know, we have a political row in the UK today because the Labour leader, who may become our Prime Minister next year, has said that he wants to block new oil and gas production in the UK. So, you know, we do need to try to think about how to join in to some of these discussions. I write in my book, you know, I was speaking outside about British politics. In fact, they both became Prime Minister last year, Liz Truss and Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. You probably read about some of that in the UK. It was very interesting to me that the yard pole by which we measured how long Liz Truss would survive was a biodegradable vegetable.
Yeah.
Right. It was a lettuce.
Yeah.
The
lettuce won.
Nature beat humans again.
Yeah.
Right. In this particular case, you know, I think that those transitions into they were both asked, do we want to have more solar and wind farms in the UK? And we are by law required by 2035 supposed to be having wind farms and solar that would, if all of it was built, would quintuple the current production. If it was all built, it would be about the same amount of land covered in the UK as by golf courses. And you know, I'm not anti-golf. I mean, they're very consumption of water, but that doesn't seem to me a particularly bad price to pay. Environmentally, as it happens, we talked about this last time, when you have overdependence on energy sources from autocratic states and ones that are non-democratic, you reinforce bad practices. You know, we talked again when I was here last time, a 2018 report by the Foreign Affairs Committee in the UK, which said that the way in which London acted as a financial centre to launder Russian money and oligarch wealth was a threat to British national security. And we didn't address any of that. It turns out it was a major threat to British national security, major impact on bank interest rates, inflation, on poverty, all these things that we didn't sit and pay attention to. And again, because we had to talk about democracy, that requires our political leaders to be better read, to have a bit of time, maybe we need to give them a few days every year to go back to university, to go back to hear about what are the latest ideas in research, in medicine, in plant sciences, etc. You know, and again, in the UK, we're going to spend more on diabetes in 5 years' time than we spend on cancer research, because 2/3 of the population in the UK are obese. And those kinds of things are once you identify the problem, how we were trained as historians, what's the problem? How do you now solve it? And the climate is one of these things that can be solved. But there needs to be much more thinking that goes into being able to work out what needs doing. And again, because we like to talk about democracy, the single biggest challenge I think we have now in Europe is bringing young people along on our next journey. The dissatisfaction that young people have with political systems and with political leaders is absolutely acute in the European Union and in the UK. A poll produced at the end of last year had 60% of people under the age of 45 surveyed, and surveys are always a bit, what's the question, who asks you, and so on. But it was a big survey size by Pew Research. 60% of people under 45 said there wasn't a need for regular elections, right? And all my students, when you talk to them and you say, how do you see the world? They say, we'll never get an academic post. There's more or less gone. In the subject of medieval studies, last year in the United States, which is a massive economy, great institutions, universities, last year there were 5 academic posts in medieval studies, right? The number of people doing PhDs in Middle Ages, it's disappearing. They say, we'll never get a job, we'll never buy a house, because we won't be able to afford it. We have debts from studying, which we much worse in the UK than you do here. Your generation all got rich, burnt stuff, didn't pay any attention, got Putin wrong, got China wrong, got everything all wrong, and you all traveled to Thailand on holiday. Now you're telling us that we can't and shouldn't. You burnt the house down while allowing these morons to take power and mess things up. And that's a universal story in Europe where one of the reasons Putin invaded Ukraine was he looked at Macron, the Gilets jaunes, he looked at Boris Johnson and his parties, and then it turned into Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. He looked at the rise of the far right and the far left in here in Holland, in Italy, the way in which Poland and Hungary were going, where we forget this. 2 years ago, there were discussions in Brussels about whether Poland and Hungary should be sanctioned and maybe suspended from the European Union membership, right? We've forgotten that now because the Poles have been heroic in what they've contributed to Ukraine. Hungary, it's a bit more grey in what how the story has gone with the Ukraine invasion. But that story about young people saying, what is it that you guys have got right? How are you leaving this world better for our generation is one that you can see back in many, many periods and regions in history. And that leads to real turbulence where people don't believe that problems are being solved by the elites.
Are you saying that because of the old-fashioned Russian imperialism, which is plain just fought out in Ukraine at this moment, and the fact that we burned the amazing amount of, you produced just statistics on the amount of heat we burned in this very sort of old-fashioned colonial way, that's the English, the Dutch, the Americans, are those if you have to choose between the biggest dangers for the next generation from imperialistic consequences, would that be Russia and China, or would that be the way we exhausted our planet and economy?
There's a discussion about that, but we don't need the Russians or the Chinese to make us topple over ourselves. Right? I can promise you. And the biggest problem, I suppose, I'm talking about here is the haves and the have-nots. That was kind of one of the underlying stories about Brexit. For too many people in Britain, the fact that you could go and travel and live and settle abroad didn't mean anything.
No.
Who's going to, who in deprived, low income, low educational,
in Leeds or
I don't want to pick but there were no benefits. The benefits were to the elites. The benefits to people who wanted to, and that is a problem. And I think that is a failure of governments to address egalitarianism, to make our worlds more fair. And my university, we are acutely aware, as you know, we have 3,000 places per year to give to undergraduates. It's highly competitive to get in. We try to be much more diverse than we used to, so we don't just allow chinless wonders from 3 or 4 schools to come and study there. It's very competitive, but that's a tiny percentage of a year group that's around about 800,000 people. And if you fail with social mobility, if you fail with opening opportunities, if you fail by leaving the countryside behind, different regions, if you don't have these very basic metrics, then not surprisingly people will either vote or, I promise you from history, people take things into their own hands. Russia collapsed twice in less than a week in the last 100 years. That idea of revolutionary forces in Europe in 1848.
You mean 1991 and 1917?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the reason why things work in the Netherlands and the UK and elsewhere is because we have institutions that work. But those institutions, to me,
we have rule of law and democracy.
Yeah, but those institutions are under attack. They're under attack because of freedoms of the press. They're under attack because of discussions around gender. They're under attack because of the ways in which politicians try to exploit the process of, we had the judges who ruled on Brexit as being put on the front page of one of our newspapers in the UK saying enemies of the people, in the same way that we had in the beginning of Bolshevism and so on. So those things topple over quite quickly. And the things that, for example, you read my book, I write about the French Revolution in the late 1780s. It was a time of climate turbulence, high levels of volatility. And you can cope with floods, you can cope with famines, you can cope with all these different things if they are predictable and if you've got enough slack in the system. In the late 1780s, what happened in France, there were 2 or 3 very bad years, bad winters, bad summers. that did the same kind of thing that we have today. Prices started to go up. People get worried about that because they can't afford to eat staple foods, wheat, basic things, wine, doubled in price. The King, Louis XVI, did what a modern leader would do. He said, look, guys, I understand this. I know it's a problem. Just write me a letter and tell me, I'll try and address it. He then got almost 25,000 documents over the course of 3 months. The French then appealed to the Americans to say, we need wheat. The Americans thought this is an opportunity for us, but actually we're having a tough time because our climate systems have had difficulty too. And those French who'd all written letters thought, where the hell is the action? And we demand to have accountability. We demand to see a world that is more fair. And those movements can pop very quickly from nothing. And I was with a very high-ranking conservative government minister recently, and I said, my worries about democracy and fragility. And he went, this is absolute rubbish. Young people are the luckiest there's ever been. So I said, then don't ask me. Gather a group of 18 to 25-year-olds. Ask them, what do they think? And some people might think that it's wrong, or they might think it's ridiculous. But young people, when you talk to them, they say, my mental health, I'm worried about the world I live in. I'm scared about the future. I'm scared when I read that last summer the Rhine dried up and goods couldn't move along these great water systems. I'm worried about the world I'm going to live in for my children. And again, there are statistics that some scholars are suggesting that young people are deciding to have fewer children, partly because of the cost, but also because of the worries that this world, that they're being talked into something that's scary. And it's hard not to let the narrative become one that it becomes apocalyptic. But the good thing to remind people about that is that people have been predicting the apocalypse since the beginning of writing systems, and so far, we didn't get there. We're producing more calories today than on any time in history, long life expectancies. But it's not wrong that people are worried. Yeah, my question would be, is there anybody in this room actually under the age of 25? Okay, well, it'd be great to hear what if we have some questions, whether that resonates with you about whether you think my generation and others have let you down. It'd be really great to hear. You don't have to ask a question, but your comments would be great on that.
We will get to you with a microphone later on. You put it very concisely. I dotted it down. I had to look for it. But where rain stopped and crops failed, in the political chaos that ensued, dictators and gods have thrived. When our environment goes by the wayside, diseases come, and actually democracy fails. And free society. Yes.
It creates opportunity, volatility, and risk. Creates opportunity. The 2008 financial crisis led to one of the greatest redistributions of wealth in human history. Putin's invasion of Ukraine led, in the course of 2022, to one of the largest movements of capital from Europe into the Middle East, into carbon-producing and fossil fuel-producing states. The profits of the oil majors in 2022 was $850 billion profits. Right, and because the prices went up, because Putin decided to invade Ukraine, attack Chernihiv, attack Kyiv, etc., and this had a macroeconomic compression that we are not looking at what's happening to poverty in the global world, where people can't have governments to step in to buy LNG gas that our governments did, weren't able to do things that we did in Europe. We turned around, we bought in my country and in the Netherlands, I'm afraid. We pre-bought gas, LNG that was about to be unloaded into ports in Pakistan. We paid a premium to send the tankers to decouple them and send them back here to Europe. That left people in other parts of the world short. And that space is being exploited by, amongst others, our friends in Moscow, or not friends in Moscow and in Beijing, whose story is all, this is how you get treated by the West, which is you get left behind. And Putin, in a speech that he gave to the Russian parliament in February, it was not aimed for our ears, but it was aimed for the ears in the developing world, which is that, he said, the West has put $170 billion into defending Ukraine, has spent $60 billion a year on global development. Why? And, the Russians are not, I think one has to treat very carefully these kinds of statements, but they are working out what their story is. One of the reasons why half the countries in Africa either abstained or voted against condemning the invasion of Ukraine a year ago was because the efforts, half the countries in Africa at the UN, because the efforts diplomatically and politically that have been gone into dovetailing this story to say, Western societies call themselves democracies, but actually they are always feathering their nests, they're burning, and the high levels of current Russian activity of interventions in our climate movements in Europe is a real problem. It's a real challenge, particularly in the Baltics. Scandinavia has been about getting embedded into climate discussions to say to young people, you should be shit scared, excuse my language, but this is what will happen, and you're going to face a world where you need to evict your current political leaders.
And again, after writing this book, the same question, if you have to choose, what makes you more scared? Is it the big empires of China and the dictators Xi and Putin, or is it the environmental problem?
I was more scared growing up in the 1980s than I am today.
Yeah, so it's the environment.
My life, our life, in the 1980s, it was inevitable.
It's exploitation of the planet.
No, in the 1980s, there was, I thought, in fact, I would say my generation knew that there would be a major nuclear confrontation in our lifetimes.
Yeah, it didn't happen.
If we were lucky, you'd be in the blast radius. If you're really unlucky, you'd be in the sort of radiation fallout and die painfully and slowly. There were hugely successful films and cartoons like this that rammed it in all the time. And actually that concentrated the minds in Moscow and Washington to agree arms limitations around the environmental concerns.
So that didn't happen, and you just said, apocalyptic times have been preached, from time immemorial, when we started writing at least, and maybe even before that. But then you end your book with, if we don't do anything, the environment will hit sort of back, and we will, with fewer of us around to burn fuel, cut down forests because we all died, and tear minerals from the Earth's crust, the human footprint may become drastically reduced, and we will move closer to the sustainable, lush paradise of our fantasized, of course, past. And then the last sentence, perhaps we will find our way back there through peaceful means. Semicolon, a historian would not bet on it. Now, you're a historian, so you don't believe that we're going to... That's very, very, very grim, of course.
Well, let me give you a couple of sort of sign-off facts, right? We have the highest carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere for the last 2 million years, right? They've more than doubled since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There are about 200 parts of carbon per million molecules. Now we're at 426, something like that. And I can promise you, if you read the history, I do lots before the humans arrive on the planet, this Earth was not probably designed just for us, regardless of what one's religious beliefs might be. But biology and nature and survival of the fittest, evolution, are all about adaptation. Our human history is all about failure, right? The Achaemenid Empire, the Abbasids, the Barmakids.
The Romans.
They're gone.
Yeah.
Beautiful to go and visit, but they're gone. That process of failure is the relentless one. And that failure is about failure to adapt to crisis and to shocks. And that's why we are here where we are. But, and the world looks as it does. But if you take a longer view, then it's inevitable that, a few things are inevitable. Number one, the change of political centers of power, highly dependent on resources. So if we'd been sitting here in Amsterdam 130 years ago and we said, what do you think about the Middle East as a place to, extract? We said there's nothing to extract. It turns out the oil and the gas were maybe not the only story of the 20th century, but a really, really important one. Alongside Bolshevism, totalitarianism, etc. But competition for the Middle East from the First World War until the fall of Saddam Hussein and beyond, have shaped so much of our world. Those will change now to copper, to lithium, to rare earths. Those centers will adapt and move dependent on what it is that we need. But there are a few things in that are inevitable, and the things that make me most worried is that the climate stuff we will hopefully mitigate some of. In the North Pole at the moment is 3.5 degrees warmer than it was 22 years ago. That's not great. In Alberta, in Canada, in the first 2 weeks of May, the temperature record was broken 158 times. That world that we're living in requires more than last summer when we got 40 degrees here in Europe, you in the Netherlands too. Amongst the decisions to try to get in the way of that was the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, said government officials didn't need to wear ties to their meetings. In Hanover, the
radical.
municipal authorities said that no one was allowed to have a hot shower after swimming. And if you've been to Hanover, no one has a hot shower, ever. Because the Germans love the freezing cold water. The Greek government said that they would turn off the lights at tourist attractions at 3 a.m., which is, guys, just don't have the lights on at all. Maybe people's Instagram can cope for a few months while it's this hot. Those levels of intervention look to me much too small. Not a single one of the G20 countries is within its agreements of what it gave in Paris in 2015 for cutting its emissions. There's a survey, please, I warn you this time about my bad language, which is not my bad language. We did a TV, there was a BAFTA's, the big TV and film agency in the United States. Please forgive my language, or put cotton in your ears, or parsley. In the last 2 years, they've been measuring how often climate change and global warming have been mentioned on TV, right? This is a good indication of how seriously the real world is taking it, not us in Balie on a Thursday night it's Thursday, right? Yeah, Thursday night in Amsterdam, enlightened, interested, engaged, worried. The word cheese was mentioned on British TV in 2021 33,000 times. The word dog 140,000 times. The word global warming, or the phrase global warming, 800, and climate change about twice that. The word
800.
800. Total. About half the number of times that Shakespeare was mentioned. And if you excuse my language, particularly to our very distinguished guest here this evening, the climate change and global warming were both mentioned only twice as often as the word motherfucker, which is, if you watch British TV, is not mentioned often. But and it's really not mentioned often. I struggle to think I've ever heard that word, apart from at Balie on a Thursday evening, but to illustrate my point. And I think that is that there is awareness that there's a problem. The lack of engagement around climate reminds me of the profound lack of engagement before the pandemic. And as you know, as we spoke about it last time, I was in Downing Street in December 2019. They came and said, what's the biggest risk? China, Russia, what's the big things you're worried about? In Huawei, we were worried about that. We don't even care anymore about 5G and who's listening. Now it's AI, and are we going to have singularity? I had the Indian Army last week saying to me, should we be worried about automation and singularity where humans, we become obsolete, dead? And I said, the thing you should worry about in this room is pandemic and the lack of global response. And the National Security Advisor invited me and said, how do you think that went afterwards? I went, not great. Because I said, why, if it was me in the audience, I'd say, why would you mention that, not Huawei or China or whatever. What makes you say that? And we could have solved the pandemic much cheaper, much easier, with so many fewer deaths, if we had realized what was coming. And it's the same thing with climate. If we throw money at the problem, I'm sure we will solve lots of it. I'm sure there are lots of new technologies that we can use, AI and otherwise, to control flights, to work out how we can make savings of waste in the first case, before we even think about transitions. Very easy to think about how we might do that. But it's really difficult and expensive to solve things at speed. It's a bit like, driving at, I was going to say 10 miles, you can drive too slowly on the motorway, but driving at 50 miles an hour in the slow lane, with plenty of space in the car in front, bad things tend not to happen, right? Doing 130 kilometers an hour in the fast lane with someone really close behind you, and you suddenly see the traffic through the rain, that's when there are problems. And as a historian, if you ask me, are we in the slow lane thinking, or are we in the fast lane making bad decisions? I would say it looks to me that we are making bad decisions.
In the fast lane.
Yeah.
We're making bad decisions, and we've been making them. We've been making those bad decisions actually for thousands of years, if you read this, and we're still here. So maybe we're not smart enough, maybe AI is smart enough to figure it out.
I'll tell you what, just about imperialism, 80% of the entire expenditure of the United States government is from the US Department of Defense. Okay, it's the single biggest institutional consumer of fossil fuels globally. 560,000 facilities around the world, 800 bases. It costs about $25,000 per hour to keep one F-35 in the air, just on its fuel costs. And the expenditure on defense, which is now going to go up for all of us for obvious reasons, is going to be an energy soak on the kinds of ways in which we live. And defense and armies are expressions of imperialism, both as offensive but also as defensive mechanisms.
I think our imperialism is killing us. That's my conclusion, actually, from the book and from the talk. Thank you very much, Peter Frankopan. A real pleasure again talking to you. I think we need to ask one woman or man in the audience.
I know, women,
under 25.
there's scientific research. If a woman asks the first question in any talk, other women are much more likely, statistically, much more likely to ask questions too.
That's what we found out here by just doing it.
I mean, that's a measurable fact. And young people especially, if possible.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much, first of all. I think my question is, you mentioned briefly the haves and have-nots issue, and then the fact that this entire room is probably very high educated and interested and worried. But how do you say, or how would you recommend us to think about how to engage all people in society into this problem when, they're clearly also dealing with other issues, coming from globalization, etc.?
It's a good question. I mean, my immediate answer is that, I'm a very small cog in a machine, and my answer will always be, you start by educating people. That's my job, so I suppose it won't surprise you to say that. We should educate young people about environmental history, about climate histories. We should educate young people like it's the 21st century rather than the 19th century, where we train people to memorize things and to regurgitate a series of facts, rather than what I think young people should be doing and all people should do, just know how to grow carrots, know how to milk a cow, know where things come from, be able to understand supply chains, and to realize that they have choices. It's in my book too, my shirt, all of our shirts, require about 7,500 litres of water. I had no idea. That's the average consumption of water for a human being for 7 years. So my job is not to tell people then don't buy any more shirts, but once you're armed with these facts, maybe people can make different kinds of decisions. But there's no question that the inequality of knowledge, the inequality of the ways in which we distribute clean solutions is something which we need to think much more rounded way. But for me, it starts in the classroom. I think it would help for politicians to engage. I don't know your political system here as well as I should do. But you in the Netherlands, by and large, are pretty good on the metrics of recycling, sustainability, energy consumptions. But those global discussions in parts of the world I go to and spend time in is, you manage to become rich in the West. How do we benefit? So, in New Delhi, for example, the air quality is so bad that it's the equivalent of every single man, woman, and child smoking 40 cigarettes per day. Across Southeast Asia, which doesn't include China and India, which are home to some of the dirtiest cities on earth, just Southeast Asia, so Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, every single man, woman, and child lives for a year and a half less than they would do if they breathed clean air. And those clean air is not just about your respiratory system, cognitive decisions, your ability to make decisions, abilities to stay away from violence, from self-harm, from all sorts of whole range of things that my colleagues in the sciences work on, show that we should be addressing this very aggressively. But what role we have in Europe to engage with other parts of the world looks to me very limited, because we've become very introverted, which makes me worried and sad. Thank you very much. We're running 10 minutes late, but we started 10 minutes late as well, so that's only fair in a Dutch way. Being very precise. In the Dutch way, if you start 10 minutes late, you should add 15, right? Thank you very much again. Thank you, Claudia Jongstra, and thank you, Peter Frankopan. We're looking forward to 4 days of amazing programs. Tonight at 8, there's Tino Segal from Germany, from Berlin. There's Ukrainian theater at 8:30 here in the main hall. There's amazing works of art to see here. Have a look at Claudia Jongstra's. Don't touch it, but while you're working out, have a look at it. There's other works. There's Antonis Pitas from Athens upstairs. We Cannot Move, it's called. There is the installation of Julian Hetzel in the Pleinzaal.
a wonderful work of art. You can. It's running for 4 days. It's happening. There will be Simon Chama on Sunday twice. There will be Etchi Temelkuran tomorrow. No, the day after tomorrow. So thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you at some of the other talks or events. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very, very much.